After that musical introduction, we're going to be starting with the Ayn Rand and science fiction panel. Ayn Rand never wrote conventional science fiction, yet her philosophy of objectivism has left a lasting mark on the genre. We will be exploring how her celebration of reason, individualism, and the heroic innovator shaped works from Atlas Shrugged to libertarian space opera, and we will consider the appeal and limitations of Randian themes in speculative fiction. I'm going to begin by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and just discuss briefly their connections with Ayn Rand and her philosophy, and I'd like them to define what is Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And hopefully by the time we've worked our way through the panel, we'll have a complete idea. I can start at the far end. Sure. Lowell, if you'd like to lead us off.
I'm Lowell Jacobson. I guess this is on. It's on? Check. Nope. Hi, I'm Lowell Jacobson. I like many people, probably discovered Ayn Rand at some point in my teen years, starting with The Fountainhead and then Atlas Shrugged, and then I pretty much devoured all the nonfiction I could get my hands on as well. I don't know that I ever formally considered myself an objectivist, but I was, and to this day still am, pretty strongly influenced by a lot of Ayn Rand's philosophy and ideals. I think she was probably a better diagnostician than she was a treatment practitioner. But I think, as we've seen over the last 10 years, a lot of the things she predicted that, just when I was a teenager would have been ridiculed as caricature, turned out to have been pretty accurate as to the way the left developed and their pathologies when their ideas were taken to their logical extreme. In terms of defining objectivist philosophy, essentially the short, standing on one leg version, I would say, is live by reason. And even if that leads to things that seem silly, its reason is the way you go through life and the way you understand the universe.
Let's see. Okay, I think I'm on. Hello, my name is Samuel Oatley. My qualifications are mostly dabbling in objectivist philosophy. I was likewise introduced to Ayn Rand in middle school, believe it or not high school, like most people have their political years. I spent a whole summer reading Atlas Shrugged, because it takes a whole summer for a middle schooler to read Atlas Shrugged. And I mostly read it out of a challenge because my father had actually gotten a little bit into Ayn Rand during the late 2000s financial and economic crises that occurred. And it affected our area very heavily in Florida. So my father got into it, and I got into it. And I've mostly just sort of poked my head in every couple of months into objectivist thought and just considered it and examined how I feel about it at different points in my life. Defining objectivism, I would say it would be called radical individualism. Because in Rand's philosophy, the individual is the be-all, end-all of all philosophy. She does not believe in any collectivism. She does not believe in any divine right of kings. She doesn't even believe in divinity. It is not a religion in the sense of a god or deities as we think of them. The sole morality is that which allows the individual the highest amount of freedom to pursue their individual interests. And it's essentially finding that balance between how all individuals can achieve that individual desire.
Okay. I'm Tony Andarian. I'm a retired computer scientist and now indie epic fantasy author and game developer for the Sanctum of the Archmage saga. For those who may have read some of my work or played some of my games, my work is actually very heavily influenced by Ayn Rand's philosophy. I discovered Ayn Rand a number of decades ago that I don't want to be specific about, or it'll confess my age. I discovered Ayn Rand decades ago. I have studied her philosophy fairly intensively over the course of years, so I know it extremely well. And I also spent a number of years as an advocate for her philosophy, including about a decade as the president of the New York Objectivist Club, which promoted events to exploring her ideas and projects of intellectual activism and events about philosophy. In defining her philosophy, I mean, there's a famous question where she was asked to define her philosophy, and she said, "I can do it. Can you do it while standing on one foot?" And she did, and she said the standing on one foot definition is: in metaphysics, objective reality; in epistemology, reason; in ethics, self-interest; and in politics, capitalism. I would also add romantic realism and aesthetics, but that was far enough afield from the basics of philosophy that she was being asked about at the time. The important thing, I think, that with regard to understanding her philosophy is that she is known for being a radical individualist, but that's not at the core of her philosophy. The central premises of her philosophy are in the first three areas: in the insistence on objective reality, or wishing won't make it so, as she put it; the insistence on reason as man's means of knowledge. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't live by contradictions. And in ethics, she said self-interest, but the core of that really is the idea that man has a right to live for his own sake. You own your own life. Your life belongs to you. It doesn't belong to others. You're not owed unchosen duties to other people. And her views on that ended up being very prophetic, because we hear a lot today about the danger of what's being referred to as basically predation on people's kindness or sorry?
Weaponized empathy.
Weaponized empathy, that's the phrase I was trying to recall. Ayn Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged effectively about weaponized empathy and the consequences of it. And that was, what, 70 years ago now, 75 years?
Yeah.
So in any event, that's a quick introduction to what I think of her ideas and my background.
My name is Hans Schantz. I was introduced to Ayn Rand when I was in high school, and I'm one of the rare people who became familiar with Rand through her nonfiction. I read her nonfiction first, and only then did I turn to look at her fiction, stories like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. I was interested in her philosophy of objectivism in doing what was called Lincoln-Douglas debating, where you debate values propositions, and I realized all the values propositions people were talking about were all just effectively appeals to authority, and I knew enough about logic to know that that was a logical fallacy, and I wanted something better. So I appreciated how she framed her ethics and argued that it had a rational basis in reality and wasn't just an arbitrary precept that someone had made up, or an appeal to authority or to tradition or something along those lines. As far as professional work, I've written some work on Atlas Shrugged. I wrote a table of contents, and I actually wrote a chronology of Atlas Shrugged that got published back several decades ago now. So I've done a little bit of professional work writing in the area that's been collected in anthologies or books on the subject. And I think our panelists covered objectivism pretty well. So I'll turn to the question of Atlas Shrugged. Is there anyone here who has not read Atlas Shrugged? Okay, so we do have a few. Atlas Shrugged is a dystopian story that portrays what would happen if the creators of the world decided to go on strike. So, she portrays a world in which innovators and creators are exploited through the weaponized empathy that Tony was talking about. And one man, her hero, John Galt, decides to lead a strike of all of the creators who are keeping the world alive through their work. Now, I wanted to ask our panelists if her story, Atlas Shrugged, should be considered science fiction, why or why not, and what its strengths and weaknesses are. So who would like to lead us off on that one?
I can start with that. So I think Atlas Shrugged is is light science fiction. There's really only sort of one MacGuffin in there, which is the invention of Rearden metal, which is essentially like a super titanium that is really light and really strong, and Rearden is the only one who knows how to make this sort of super alloy. And it's able to do all sorts of new things, including some that are unappreciated until later on in the book. But that's really the only sort of sci-fi element. If you wanted to be snarky, you could say that her insistence that people are perfectly rational and will act rationally as portrayed in the book is a sci-fi element too. There's some truth to that. I think that's more funny snark than substantive, but I think it's worth mentioning anyway. It is sci-fi. I think it does what, in my view, sci-fi or speculative fiction sort of has to do, which is you're changing or removing a technological constraint on the human experience and then exploring the implications of that.
Well, I would say that it is a sci-fi because there actually is one explicit sci-fi element, which is the motor that John Galt invents. And it's a motor that basically takes the energy from the atmosphere, pulls it in, and transforms it into energy. And this is a very big deal because that is a virtually limitless power source. And I would say that it's kind of what I call a Trojan horse sci-fi, where it presents itself as like this fairly grounded, realistic idea for the first half of the book. Then we learn about the motor. And then we learn about Galt's Gulch, where he's created this like secret enclave in the Rocky Mountains. And one thing you have to remember is that when this book was published, and during a large portion of Rand's career, she was coming up for her first few years of her career when pulp magazines were very much in vogue and were still the big thing. Atlas Shrugged came after that period, but a lot of the ideas there are very light science fiction, but the idea of like creating your own little enclave with this higher technology, that was a science fiction concept that many had dealt with, as well as the idea of sort of a quasi-lost world, except in this case it wasn't a lost world, it was a world created. So I think it very much is a science fiction story with just it's just not revealed as a science fiction story until a good way into the book.
So I take a slightly different perspective on this. I think that Atlas Shrugged can be considered science fiction, but I don't think it really is at its core. I think that it's basically what I guess we would call contemporary fiction, but with science fiction elements. And there are very definite science fiction elements in it, but the book is not about science fiction in the same way that most science fiction stories are about the science fiction elements that define the story. Atlas Shrugged is a I'm trying to think of the right way of phrasing it. It's a study of very abstract aspect of human life. She once has said that the theme of Atlas Shrugged is the role of the mind in man's existence, and it explores the idea of what happens when the men of the mind withdraw their support and their sanction from the world, and the world learns that we really need these people more than we realized. That's a general philosophical point that could or could not have been made without science fiction elements. But the science fiction elements do make it more interesting. And I think that a good way of describing it would be as a literary fiction with a strong science fiction elements in it, if that makes sense.
She did write science fiction in Anthem. I think it'd be hard to dispute that Anthem isn't science fiction.
You could argue that, but the fact that Anthem was science fiction doesn't mean that Atlas Shrugged was.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Tony. I mean, traditionally, when you have science fiction usually introduces some new scientific concept or some projected future advance, and the story revolves around the implications of that technology. I think the Atlas Shrugged does have some elements of novel technology, the Randian metal, the motor that pulls energy out of the atmosphere, which interestingly enough is technically feasible, although probably not quite to the extent that John Galt was able to fictionally do in Atlas Shrugged. But despite those elements, yes, it is primarily a commentary on the present day world that Ayn Rand saw around her of the weaponized I was about to say entropy, the weaponized empathy that is being used against creators, and that ultimately ends up exploiting creators and creators' generosity. I think that the fundamental strength of Atlas Shrugged is the wonderful way it turns a mirror back on that culture and explains a lot of the pettiness, a lot of the just mindless exploitation of, well, we're going to impose this rule, and you'll think of something, Mr. Reardon, as it's imposed on creators without any deep thought as to the implications or how the rules or regulations can be implemented or followed. It certainly has that as a strength. One of the weaknesses it has is Ayn Rand's background was a bit limited. I mean, she started off her career as a bit player, an extra in Hollywood. She worked her way up to being a writer. She worked for a while as an assistant in an architecture firm to try to get some of the culture involved in writing her other great novel, The Fountainhead. But Ayn Rand was a solitary creator. She worked by herself, writing her books with very little collaboration with other people. And that's the way she portrays creativity in Atlas Shrugged. One of the things that became really obvious to me as I was involved in my own startup was how much of a synergy there tended to be between the creative people with whom I worked, how we bounced ideas off of each other, and how the team was able to do things that any individual one of us would not have been able to do. And that is an element of the creative process that I think Ayn Rand neglects. In her story, it's always the great creator, whether it's Dagny Taggart running the railroad and giving orders to her assistants and to her minions, or Hank Reardon running his steel mill and calling the shots. There isn't an element of that showing that collaboration and that synergy that I think her novels could have benefited from. So that would be what I would highlight as strengths and weaknesses. The next question I want to have our panelists address is what other authors or genres do you see as being most influenced by Rand? And I'll ask you to also cite what works you think were most influenced by Rand or most show the influence of Ayn Rand's philosophy.
Sure, I guess I can start again. I mean, I'll give the easy answer because I'm going first, which is basically everything Terry Goodkind wrote before he died. I think he actually did a pretty effective, especially I think it was Faith of the Fallen was the most notable of that, where it was basically like Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead had a baby in the book in a fantasy setting, and it worked. It was a very, updated contemporary fantasy world portrayal of Ayn Rand's ideas, and how even doing things on the micro level, not giving in to evil, not sanctioning it, has an effect that you're able to demonstrate by example. You know, and it's the objectivist themes are present in his books to a lesser or greater extent, but it's a pretty consistent theme of well-integrated objectivist philosophy throughout all Terry Goodkind's writing. Another example I'll give is sort of the bad guys in the BioShock video game that came out maybe a decade ago. Andrew Ryan, yeah. You know, I think they made it. You know, it was not inaccurate, but it was to use a phrase of a friend of ours. It was not a charitable portrayal of objectivist philosophy.
Yeah. In regards to subgenre, this one, it's kind of strange because I don't think it was a conscious reflection, but I noticed that a lot of YA novels, like dystopian novels, actually had a lot of interesting parallels to some of Rand's work. This one wasn't a recent one, but there was some of you might know the story Lois Lowry's The Giver. And the funny thing is, reading that, there's a shockingly large amount of parallels between that story and Ayn Rand's Anthem, because it's all about a person sort of discovering this supposedly utopian society is not so great, and this person sort of having their moment of growing up is basically rejecting the society and going off into the woods away from the society. And it even kind of ends the same with them finding a house that they kind of envisioned at one point. So there is a lot of influence, I think, in YA novels with just the general concept of the young protagonist sort of coming into a realization and separating themselves from this collectivist society.
So that's interesting. I don't read YA, so it's not something I would have noticed, but it's interesting to hear that might be a connection. My first answer was going to be the same as yours. Terry Goodkind is a major influence on my work, as well as Ayn Rand, and he is probably the most strongest example of someone who was very explicitly influenced by Rand. But there were a lot of others, and there's a whole tradition of libertarian science fictional thought that draws inspiration from, not necessarily following Rand. You can name Heinlein, for example, was clearly influenced by Rand. L. Neil Schulman and a few other authors in that same tradition. So that's sort of a theme that's run through a lot of, again, libertarian-oriented science fiction. People who know the rock band Rush, the album 2012 is loosely based on Anthem, and there are other examples. I'm trying to think if there are any other ones that jump out at me. I mean, wait 5 years and you'll also be able to add Sanctum of the Archmage to that list. But
We can add that now.
okay, fair enough.
Well, I'll I wanted to mention the specific works. I think Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is probably the most Randian of the works that he came up with. I also wanted to highlight L. Neil Smith. He did kind of multiple universe, cross-worlds story. Was it Probability Broach? Yeah, that is very libertarian and Randian influenced. And the one story I wanted to highlight, because it generally doesn't get mentioned in the connection with Ayn Rand, is I was really impressed by John Christopher's White Mountain series. It's very reminiscent of her story Anthem, but it portrays as in Anthem's setting is a future world where society has collapsed and people are enslaved by the bad philosophy that caused the collapse, and someone has to rediscover right philosophy and how to live. And John Christopher's White Mountain trilogy is about a boy growing up on a future Earth that has been conquered by aliens who artificially enforce a relatively primitive level of technology, and as you come of age, they implant a metal cap to control your life. And he decides to rebel against that and run away. And it's very reminiscent of Ayn Rand's Anthem in terms of being kind of a coming of age and rediscovering individual freedom and liberty in a setting where it's been crushed by under a totalitarian influence. The next question I want to offer our panelists is Ayn Rand still relevant today? Why or why not, or what do you think about that?
I think Ayn Rand is at least as relevant today as she ever was. As I mentioned in, I guess, my opening remarks, I think the way in which she diagnosed the end-state pathologies of leftism, the new left. I mean, she was writing about this stuff. It will give you chills if you read her nonfiction, her contemporary writings. The stuff she called out in the 1950s, 1960s, and predicted would happen, and people, even in the 90s, early 2000s, would mock her for like, oh, you're caricaturing people, nobody actually does this. And then we get into, peak woke, and they're literally doing, like, it stopped being fiction. I forget who it was, but there was a blogger, a post I saw or something, he said, like, make Atlas Shrugged fiction again.
Yes.
It's frightening how prescient she was, because one of her fundamental insights, or maybe a few of her fundamental insights taken together, were, the more pure version of an idea is always going to beat a mixed version, and you iterate that a few times, and you get the moderate Democrats being beaten by the harder core Democrats, and you end up with AOC and and Bernie Sanders and the actual socialists, because their message is pure and it's more compelling, and they can always say, like, I'm philosophically consistent. They may be wrong and evil, but when they're pitching a message, they don't have to answer charges of hypocrisy. And so, she played that dynamic through to the end and predicted a lot of what we've seen, and I think there's a lot of insight and benefit to be gained by reading her nonfiction as well. And she really did an excellent job sort of picking apart the roots of these pathologies.
Yeah, and I think she still very much is relevant today for the simple reason that we still have this conflict of collectivism versus individualism. And you have to understand that when Rand was writing this, her philosophy and her works, this was at the time when the Cold War was still going on. Rand was originally from the Soviet Union and kind of understood that totalitarian mindset. And the thing is, it's not as if collectivists don't exist today. Like, who's one of our biggest rivals? China. And I was talking the other day, Ayn Rand had an unproduced screenplay called Red Pawn, and it was about a love triangle at a Soviet gulag. And the funny thing was, I was kind of looking over the synopsis of it, and I go, you could easily do this at like if you were doing a modern version of it, you could do it at a Chinese concentration camp and just sort of examine how people just sort of lose their minds with collectivism and their values sort of shed away. And a lot of times those people aren't necessarily evil, they're just misguided, or they are maybe overly optimistic about the brotherhood of man. So I think she very much is relevant today, and you very much could make adaptations of her work that could speak to today's society.
I definitely think that Rand is still relevant, and her ideas are still relevant today. Just to follow up on part of what was said before about her prescience, because it's been commented on by many people. It comes, I think, and she thought, from the fact that one of the central premises of Ayn Rand's philosophy is about the importance of philosophy, that civilization and the course of history are largely determined by philosophic ideas, and that if you understand the basic philosophy, the basic philosophic ideas of a culture and a society, you can see where it's going. And she applied that exactly to the world that she saw in the 50s and the 60s and in the 70s, and made predictions that, as it turned out, were accurate because she understood the philosophic principles underlying those trends and the trajectory that they were leading civilization on. So I definitely very much agree with that. I do think she's very relevant today. I'm not certain that many of the people who advocate for her ideas, I could say the same thing about. This is a separate discussion, but I've become very disheartened by people who call themselves objectivists and who advocate her ideas. I think she is very badly misunderstood in today's society, and in particular by people who claim to speak for her. So the one lesson to be drawn from that, and I think which is consistent with her ideas, is that one has to approach her ideas in the spirit of her ideas with an individualist perspective, judging for yourself and not necessarily on the basis of what other people say about her.
I have to agree with our panelists. I believe Ayn Rand is still relevant today. A lot of her work speaks to today's issues and problems. One work in particular, which sadly never saw the light of day, was she worked on a movie treatment of the development of the atomic bomb and the story of Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, which, of course, just a few years ago we had the movie Oppenheimer that examined some of those issues. I'm sure Ayn Rand's treatment would have been orthogonal in many respects to what we got to see, but it would have been very interesting if that project had come to life to see her take on the subject and the moral issues involved in that creation. I would like to, let me see, do we have any audience questions that you'd like to ask the panelists? And do we have the wireless mic handy? Let me hand the mic, or would you? I'll walk around. Okay. So questions in the back, or Alex, you want to take our lead question?
Yeah.
Yeah, question for Tony. I was just curious, as someone who is very active in the sort of official objectivist circles, what did you see as the primary misinterpretations of Ayn Rand that get spread around? Because I certainly have encountered those as well and had some negative experiences. And I'm just curious how widespread those were and what you encountered.
That's a big subject, and I'll try and nail it down to two problems that I have. One is, and these are technical, but one is that if you study Rand's philosophy in detail, one of the principles of her philosophy is the idea that principles are contextual. So that there's a tendency people have to have a principle and then they apply it literally in every context, oftentimes in contexts where it doesn't make any sense. And part of her philosophy was that principles are contextual. You have to understand what gives rise to the need for the principle in reality. And if you are in a context where those things that give rise to the principle don't apply, you're outside the context of the principle and you shouldn't try to apply it. Many people who advocate our ideas don't understand that. And they, as a result, end up advocating things that you would have applied in other contexts to situations where they don't apply, sometimes disastrously. The other is, again, a philosophic error called rationalism, which is basically the idea of trying to deduce truth solely from prior premises without empirical knowledge entering into it. There's a lot of rationalism in Rand's amongst the people who advocate her ideas, and it's sometimes a little shocking how much people who advocate her ideas, which are supposed to be based on reason, leave out empirical knowledge that's directly relevant to the question that they're addressing. That would be my short answer.
Do we have another question in the back?
Not so much a question, just in
Well, you'll get the microphone in just a moment.
The portrayals in fiction. Iron Man 2 was probably the best filmed version of Reardon's speech that we're going to get.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed at the Atlas Shrugged movies. I attended the Atlas Shrugged premiere in Hollywood of the first movie. It was really interesting, and I didn't get. Everyone was there was just a huge crowd, and I didn't get to see like Barbara Brandon and some of the other objectivist notables who were there. But it was really interesting seeing her ideas brought to the screen, however, rather imperfectly, and then having a complete change in cast from movie to movie to movie just kind of ruined the experience for me. But yeah, it is interesting to see how versions of her ideas are making it onto the film, either in like the version of Atlas Shrugged that we did get to see, that at least had the virtue of being pretty true ideologically to the script, to the ideas. They didn't distort the story or remove the power armor when they were doing the treatment or the adaptation of her novel.
One quick addendum to that regarding the movies. One of the interesting things about it was that the person who had purchased the rights to make the Atlas Shrugged movie and held them for many years was coming up on a deadline where if he didn't start the movie within weeks, he was going to lose the rights. And the person who held the rights, Leonard Peikoff, had decided not to sell them, not to extend the contract. So they were forced to make the first movie on very, very short notice in a rush. And the irony of it was that it was the best of the three movies. The one that they had to rush through without giving it much thought and time to develop ended up being the best. By the second movie, which they had much more time to develop, they had more time to ruin, which was an irony that was not lost on a number of us.
We had another question in the back.
Yeah. So I agree I think a lot of Ayn Rand's observations are spot on, and I agree with a lot of her ideas, but in my opinion, as a novelist, she's just not very good. I find like The Fountainhead and Anthem, it was just too on the nose and too predictable, I thought, and almost unreadable for me. So I'm curious, and this is a question I wanted to ask Ayn Rand's fans for a long time. Am I a lunatic for expressing those thoughts, or do you see some truth in that, and yet you find her ideas so powerful that that is more important to you than her ability as a fiction writer?
Well, I have to admit, when I read Atlas Shrugged, I skimmed John Galt's speech. I mean, it was one thing about her writing. It is so she so powerfully conveys her point, and at no point does she stop. So at a certain point, you're going, I get it. I agree. I don't need to read. Yes, I know this. I don't need to. I already saw that. I get the point you're making. I mean, it's over and over and over and over again. So
bones are dust.
It can be, yeah. It can be kind of overwhelming. So I can understand some of the criticisms of her work and the how the long speeches tend to take you out of the action. And I know that was a lesson that I took to my writing. My story, The Hidden Truth, is a little bit of a reaction to Ayn Rand, in that I wanted to do something kind of similar, but show how creators or innovators are work with and are helped by their family and by their friends and so forth in order to accomplish goals. And I drop a little historical and political lectures into the novels here and there where I can, trying to keep the Ayn Rand example in mind as what not to do, and not to have an 80-page speech inserted somewhere in my plot.
So a quick thought on that, because this is actually something that I've thought a great deal about. I think Ayn Rand's writing is brilliant, so there is room for disagreement on this. However, Rand did have several flaws as a writer, and one of them, I think, is exactly what's being discussed. Her tendency to overemphasize, overwrite, and basically hit a point with a sledgehammer repeatedly until it's been ground into dust. And that is enjoyable if you agree with her ideas, and I had fun with it. But it doesn't make for necessarily for good writing. So one of the things that I'm actually deliberately and consciously attempting to do with my own writing is to deal with some of the same themes, but to try to do it much more subtly, to, as it were, not hit the point over the head with a hammer, but to state it, show it in the context of the events of the story, and let people draw their conclusions. I think that's a very effective way of doing that. However, I did read Galt's speech all the way through the first time, and that was because I read it. I read the book right after I graduated from college and had been subjected to contemporary civilization courses that tried to teach me very bad ideas in philosophy. And so reading Galt's speech to me was a concerto of deliverance. She was refuting all of the things that I had rebelled against in my philosophy courses. Your mileage may vary with regard to that reaction.
Well, I agree that when it comes to some of the finer details, Rand doesn't always work as a writer. As everyone's mentioned, she tends to overemphasize things and really hammer the point home. But one thing that I actually do really appreciate about Rand's work is that she was actually a pretty good plotter. Like
Yes.
the actual
Yes.
plots, they move very smoothly from each idea and each event. And it's actually something that you can kind of see from Anthem, which is really simplistic and really straightforward. And as she moves her way up to Atlas Shrugged, which is a complex plot, but it's very easy to follow because Rand does set up the pieces very well. And again, I suspect some of that probably comes from her days in Hollywood when she was a Hollywood scripter. And with a lot of the scripts and treatments for film you have to, especially back then, you had to keep it very tight, very focused. Can't have an extraneous shot or scene. So while I agree with some of the finer details that she maybe wasn't the best at, I absolutely do think plotting-wise, she was
Yes.
very good.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add, like, I really like her use of imagery. I think she created
Yeah.
incredibly powerful sentences as well. I mean, I still remember, like, just a number of them, from books I haven't read in a while. One other point I'll add is that I think English was her fifth language.
Yeah.
So if you can write that well, taking aside, how it stands on its own in the abstract, if you can write like that in your fifth language, that's pretty impressive.
I wanted to add one thing on to kind of reinforce what Lowell was saying about her use of symbols and symbolism in her stories. It was, like, just to give an example of one that really stuck with me, was the concept of having the bad guys, her villains, who are the dregs, the lowest of low morally in society, meeting on the top of a high skyscraper in a bar that's designed to look like it's down in the basement, that it's this dungeon that's on top is a penthouse, but with no windows, so it looks like it's buried underground. And just how she worked that symbolism into illustrating figuratively the morality of her villains and the moral inversion that they were trying to create. So there's lots of little stylistic things like that she just drops in that are very well thought out. And it's on a second or third reading that you look at it and you say, oh, that's why this chapter is called The Top and the Bottom.
Bottom,
I think that's
The
chapter
bottom of
3.
the top.
Yeah, or the bottom of the top, okay. And the other thing, I constructed a chronology of Atlas Shrugged, and that really gave me an appreciation for how tightly plotted it was. Basically, what I did was I read the story and I put everything in chronological order. Her story as written has a lot of flashbacks to, we discover only later what happened 20 years before. And it was amazing to me when I did that chronology that everything lined up just beautifully, and you could see if you had redone the story chronologically, you'd have had a great novel that would have had good pacing just in and of itself. And I always wondered if she had done that. She almost had to have done that kind of a chronology for it to be that good. But nowhere in her papers, or at least that I've seen mentioned, does it mention a chronology where she laid out those events. So I think whatever criticisms I might have with Ayn Rand being a bit heavy-handed and overwriting on some of her points, I think she is an excellent writer, and there's a lot to learn from her as a writer from studying what she did.
Her art of fiction and art of nonfiction
Yes.
books, I highly recommend them both. As somebody who writes nonfiction extensively day to day, like I'm writing briefs. I still find myself opening it from time to time just as a refresher, and there's always a new datum in there that I will try to incorporate, something that I didn't fully appreciate. I think anybody who writes for a living will tell you that you're never done learning how to write, and to take good input from wherever you can get it. And I would definitely recommend both of her sources on that.
Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time so that we can have a little bit of a break. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their contributions.